Progressive Era. You'll see this is chapter 21, which is literally titled The Progressive Era. And we're going to be looking at mostly here the different groups that were pushing reforms. So before we get into the different groups, I really should provide you some more context for what is setting the stage for this reform. So we have in the 1890s all kinds of things combining to push forward what will be known as the progressive era. So we've got the economic depressions, we have mass suffering, we have labor violence, plus we have an uprising populist movement because of a basically ineffectual government. Basically, all of this is combining to shatter that complacency Americans felt about their nation. So now we're seeing people start to question like social Darwinism or the whole gospel of wealth. People are starting to question, does laissez-faire really work? The thing is, in 1900, we do see a return to more prosperous times, but there's still issues. For instance, a lot of big businesses became even bigger due to like mergers from 1897 through 1900. The public really wanted to control these businesses though. Also, you have things like a flood of immigrants arriving, crowding into like urban slums. This is going to overwhelm all kinds of systems like the municipal sanitation systems, the education system, fire protection services, things like that. Plus, you have working conditions are just really bad, and many men are working for really low wages, meaning that a lot of women and children have to work in order to survive. And so, like, a great example of basically everything kind of culminating together in a really bad situation during this time period was actually the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. So basically what happened was this factory, a fire broke out in it in 1911. This was in New York City, and this fire is going to kill 146 workers, and most of them were young women who are basically trapped inside the factory, because what had happened was management had literally locked the exits and locked the staircases, the fire exits. And this was to keep the women working basically and not take any extra breaks. However, when the fire breaks out, they couldn't escape. Some of the women perished inside, others would jump to their deaths, and that's actually what you're seeing here in the aftermath and everything. And so these kinds of incidences are basically causing Americans to cry out for reforms, because the United States actually had the highest rate of industrial accidents in the world at this time. So we have our different groups who are going to kind of push for different reforms. The first one is the social gospel movement. This is going to be led by like a lot of Protestant ministers, for instance, who were especially influential. Basically, this is people wanting to introduce religious ethics into industry in the United States. And so this appeals to a lot of like churchgoers, and it's seen as kind of meeting the social responsibilities at this time. But the social gospelers are going to like endorse unions and workers' rights. They very much wanted Christians to support like social reform so that they could alleviate poverty, so that they could help out the slums, so they could stop labor exploitation. So they like specifically attacked like low wages. What's really interesting though is the social gospel movement really is going to come about when we have this emerging liberal movement when it comes to American religion. Basically, during this time period, we're seeing scholars discredit like the literal accuracy of the Bible, and instead emphasize like its general moral and ethical lessons. So we're seeing America basically abandon some of that theological dogmatism and have a bit more greater tolerance of other faiths, but they're still using their faith to be interested in social problems when it comes to the social gospel. And so basically the social gospel, more than anything else, and I quote, gave progressivism a moral drive. So it turns a lot of people in favor of reform because of the moral issue of, giving back to society and improving society, and very much what would Jesus do kind of idea. Then we have our muckrakers. This is looking at journalism in particular. Basically, muckrakers were journalists who participated in a specific form of investigative reporting. The thing is, by this point, you have technology. That means you have mass circulation of like magazines and newspapers. And so all of these editors are competing for urban readership, and that's how we got things like the yellow press. But now what grows out of the yellow press is these muckrakers who are going to put forward these sensational exposés that they investigate businesses and the abuses of these businesses and the dangerous working conditions and the miseries of slum life. And on one hand, they're competing for readership, but on the other hand, they're revealing to Americans what is really going on behind the scenes in a lot of places. And this really entices the public to demand reform. A great example of this was actually a book that was published at this time, and you can see that here, The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. The thing is, this book wrote about the nauseating conditions of Chicago's meatpacking industry. The thing is, Upton Sinclair actually was writing about the meatpacking industry, trying to get people to feel for the workers' plight here. And he said, and I quote, "I aimed for the public's heart, and by accident, I hit it in the stomach." But this is going to make people want to push for reforms in these industries. Then we have the gospel of efficiency. The thing is, a lot of people hoped that with efficiency and expertise, you could really control or resolve all of the disorder in industrial society. A big proponent of this is pictured here, President Teddy Roosevelt. He was an admirer of its success. We also see a lot of corporations wanted to apply like management techniques to guide economic growth. So we're seeing businesses basically advocate for more efficiency and order and organization, things like that. I should mention an example. For instance, we have Frederick Taylor, who was a big proponent of the gospel of efficiency. He's going to propose things like, let's increase worker efficiency by having imposed work routines and speed ups and mechanization. And basically what this would do is have workers have simple and repetitive tasks, which makes them more efficient at that particular task. And this leads to more efficiency in producing items for even cheaper. There is a problem with this though, because this basically means with workers doing very simple and repetitive tasks, their skills are expendable, and so workers can basically be hired and fired at a moment's notice. And so as much as this might generate more wealth in industries, workers aren't really going to share in that wealth. Which really ties into this next group that is pushing for reforms, and that is the demands of labor. So workers are going to resist all of these rules of efficiency, and they're going to, as we've already been seeing leading up to this point, a call for like improvement of wages, the improvement of working conditions. They wanted the reduction of work hours, and they wanted the state to intervene on their behalf. And the thing is, we are going to see some of these labor demands be met during this time and be successful. A great example is going back to the whole Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. This is going to cause the creation of the New York State Factory Commission that specifically enacted laws dealing with fire hazards. Now you can't be locked in a building forced to be to work so that you can't escape if there was a fire. We have fire exits and everything like that. There's laws about this because of this time period. They would also oversee laws about like machine safety, wages, hours for women specifically. This is when we get groups like the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, hopefully you kind of are remembering them, as well as the IWW, which was the Industrial Workers of the World, also known as Wobblies. These groups are going to use like sit-down strikes, sit-ins, mass rallies. They are really going to be portrayed at different times as being like these violent revolutionaries. But most of the violence we actually see during this time that labor is involved in was actually violence committed against them. You see employers use illegal and legal means to basically destroy these labor organizations. Also, when looking at progressivism, you have to look at women. So women actually played a really key role in progressivism. We're seeing that by the early 20th century, so the early 1900s, more and more women are working outside of the home than ever before in American history. In fact, by 1910, 1/4 of all workers are women. And we're seeing increasing number of these women who are working are also married. So this is challenging all of those notions of women are supposed to be the submissive housewife that only stays home and never leaves. Now they're working. The thing is, a lot of these women are better educated than previous generations. And with that education, they have more interests, information, skills, and even confidence when it comes to a public setting. So on one hand, you have during the progressive era this push to have women become the social housekeepers of society, which on one hand is giving them more power, but it's also diminishing what their role is in society. And so by doing this, we see a lot of movements for like protecting women by having wage monitoring and making sure they had decent working conditions and safe products. But also women wanted more opportunity and to be able to work and to be able to compete with men. And so you actually see women workers unionize as well during this time, such as you get the creation of the WTUL, which is the Women's Trade Union League in 1903. And they actually do have successes when it comes to different strikes at different places and times. A lot of progressive women are going to stress that, they're supposed to be the social housekeepers. But I said, on the other hand here, because other women wanted to demand women's equal rights and they wanted to remove discrimination based upon sex. So we're seeing women getting involved in different ideas when it comes to the progressive era. The last group I want to talk about is socialists. And this is where I have to have a little bit of a disclaimer and go into this primary source just really, really quickly. Because the thing is, generally students come into this class already having some preconceived notions about what socialism is, and we tend to link up socialism and communism together, and it's a lot more complicated than that. So generally socialism is looking at workers basically owning the means of production. So this would be, rather than having one person like controlling Amazon at the top, so to speak, it would be that the people control Amazon or a corporation, if that makes sense. So please try to forget like your preconceived notions about socialism and focus on especially like what this time period is looking at, because this is when we really start seeing socialism have a lot more traction in society. So a great quote that kind of explains what socialism was at this time and how people viewed it is actually from this book, To End All Wars by Adam Hochschild. Really, really great book. This is actually a British representative, Hardy, talking about socialism. And so it says, for him, as for many other delegates, socialism was less a matter of workers owning the means of production, which is what I was just going into, although he firmly believed in that, than a moral crusade for a society that put workers before profits, public good before private wealth, and above all, peace before war. Like the spirit of the times, it was an optimistic creed. And so this is what socialism really was kind of looking at, especially early on, that yes, workers should control the means of production and everything like that, but that it was trying to push away from capitalism where the market dictates everything and supply and demand, and that we should be, looking out for the good of the workers, even if that means it's an expense to the company and everything. So when we're actually looking at socialism, we're seeing a growing influence of socialist ideas promoted during the progressive era. socialism never has a large following in the United States, but it does gain a lot of attention because it was really critical of the industrial economy, especially in the early 20th century. The thing is, socialists really condemned social and economic inequities. They criticized the limited government of this time period. They demanded public ownership of like the railroads. So think about all the farmers who are being affected by railroad rates and things like that out west. They also wanted public ownership of like utilities and communication. They're going to campaign for like tax reform, better housing, factory inspections, recreational facilities for all. A lot of muckrakers actually were socialists. I have to talk about some specific individuals though here. Eugene V. Debs, who you see pictured here, and hopefully you're going, that name sounds a little familiar. And that's because he had been imprisoned for his role in the 1894 Pullman strike. Remember that from previous? And so basically in 1901, he helped organize the Socialist Party of America. Now the thing is, this, like I said, never had a huge following, but while the Socialist Party never had a national following, it did win a lot of local elections, especially in areas that there were immigrants from specific countries like Germany and Russia, and in very poor rural areas like Oklahoma. The thing is, a lot of progressives were not for all of the progressive ideas. And so a lot of progressives viewed socialist ideas as basically too drastic and too far. But socialists are really important for all the other progressive ideals because a lot of times they're the ones that provide a support system for putting forward reform initiatives. And they're the ones that are providing support and prompting progressives to push for changes. And so they're kind of supporting a lot of the different progressive agenda, even though a lot of people wouldn't necessarily support them because they saw them as supporting everything, so to speak. So looking at these different reform groups, which do you think had the biggest effect and which do you think had the longest lasting effect?